Hello, everyone. I would like to welcome you all to this discussion today. My name is Sarah Johnson. I'm the curator for the Middle East and North Africa here at the National Museum for World Cultures in the Netherlands. And I'm very excited today to welcome my PhD supervisor, friend, and colleague, Professor Wendy Shaw, who is the professor of Art History of Islamic Cultures at the Free University in Berlin. And today we will be celebrating and discussing her new book, What is Islamic Art? Between Religion and Perception. And with me to discuss this book is Pooyan Tamimi Arab, who is Assistant Professor of Religious Studies at the Department of Philosophy and Religious Studies at Utrecht University, and Mirjam Shatanawi, who is a lecturer at the Rijnwaards Academy in Amsterdam. And between 2001 and 2018, she was a curator here at the National Museum of World Cultures. So I will not go into great detail about Wendy's book. I will let her speak to that, but I wanted to explain a little bit the background of why we invited her here. The book changes a lot about our discussion around the topic of Islamic art, its definition, whether it's useful as a term at all. But the main reason I was interested in inviting Wendy is to discuss the application of her ideas in the museum context. What does that mean for the future of museums? And so I hope we can address this today in the discussion. I will just leave us, as is so appropriate for her book, with a quote from a 12th century Iranian philosopher and writer, Al-Ghazali, which I think relates very well to what we will discuss today. So he writes, "Know that the locus of knowledge is the heart. It relates to the realities of knowable concepts as a mirror does to the form of colored objects." Thank you very much, and I'll give the floor now to Wendy. So Wendy, you can begin speaking.
Okay. I wasn't sure if I was transferred on yet. So thank you very much for inviting me. It's a pleasure to be talking with all of you. And it would be nice if we were all in person, but I think it's also really nice to be able to talk to other people in other locations. So I'll just start by showing my presentation. Because of this format, I have it pre-recorded. And as you'll see, there'll be a little bit more about the heart that'll be in it. So let's see. Here we are. And see you soon.
What is art if the main sensory organ is not the eye, but the heart? This is one of the main driving questions in my book, What is Islamic Art? Between Religion and Perception, that came out from Cambridge University Press in 2019. Today, I want to explore some of the ideas that come out of this book, with particular reference to the issue of how we can use the museum as an institution for communication, particularly when we're interested in decoloniality. In 2011, the Metropolitan Museum of Art became part of a long trend of revamping Islamic art exhibitions in Europe and the United States after the attacks of 9/11. The expectation was that these exhibits would somehow reduce anti-Muslim sentiment. We can see this premise in the statement by the curator of the exhibits, Sheila Canby. What I hope is that regardless of what is going on in the world, that people will understand how many good things have been produced in these places over the centuries, and really how deep the culture is. And what I want people to see is that not just kings and queens, but people of many levels of society surrounded themselves with beautiful objects. And this helps us understand and humanizes these cultures in a way that I think is beneficial for everyone. How well did it work? Here's one response from a sophisticated viewer, none other than the art reviewer for The New Yorker, Peter Shatanawi. He says, "The Islamic wing affords adventures and difference. It made me acutely conscious of myself as European American, a latter-day scion of the Renaissance wedding of Greek and Roman with Judeo-Christian traditions. It did this by reversing my sense of Islam as a topic of study. Rather abruptly, Islam seemed to be scrutinizing me." Obviously, something has been lost between the intentions of an excellent curatorial team and the reception of an experienced art viewer. How could we think of this in a different way? My proposition is that the organization of knowledge in the museum as we know it is predicated on a system established under the twin ideologies of modernism and colonialism, of looking from above through a supposedly universal paradigm. The matrix of this paradigm can be mapped as on a graph. One axis is time, and the other is place. The most common current paradigm of the museum places objects on this matrix. The fact that any object can be located on this graph provides the impression of a universally applicable system that also communicates equally to all subjects. Placing things within a matrix invites one to draw lines between them. These interpolations suggest change, often attributed with meaning. Here the meaning is determined by the axes, location and time, or a system commonly known as history. History, of course, offers a particular mode of knowledge. It often emphasizes documentation, yet is also driven by an implicit narrative, such as the rise and fall of civilizations or the triumph of something called progress. In a museum, our simple moving through space produces the impression that we are moving through a story that the movement of our bodies naturalizes and makes seem readily apparent and absolutely true. The interpolation between these objects maps processes of change. We interpret this narrative as offering culture. Yet in doing so, we ignore another axis through which people engaging with these objects across time and in different places have interacted with them. My book is interested in discovering the effects of this axis, which I am calling perceptual culture. It is the discursive matrix through which each subject learns to take in the world, through which a community communicates and recognizes itself, and which that community finds to be natural. A decolonial museum can't simply address the legacies of colonialism. Instead, the problem of the museum is that the way in which it structures knowledge is so deeply contained within a European way of knowing that it actually blocks out receiving information from other cultures. That is, the problem of the museum is not in its objects, but it is the way in which the museum invites visitors to think and engage with the world. If we want a decolonial museum, then we need to learn to think outside of the European episteme and learn from other epistemes in order to enable interaction and communication between cultures. When we go to a museum neatly ordered like the Metropolitan or the Louvre, full of information about time and place, we are surrounded by a vision of culture that implies a system of order. In the museum, the visitor encounters an ideal, tame world of Islam, in which all conflict has been subsumed into concepts like heritage, beauty, and relegated to the past. This past has no obvious connection with the encounter with Islam in the world outside the museum, often framed by war, alienation, terrorism, and gender inequity. The disjunction between these two visions of the Islamic world causes a cognitive dissonance, a sense of conflict that fails to humanize the other at all. It produces the sense of disjunction felt by Peter Shedhoff. The matrix of looking strengthens the feeling of control as the mythic master of knowledge, as promised by colonialism. Yet the failure to engage meaning in the objects suggests that they have another, unknowable subjectivity, which is perhaps as alienating and frightening as the images of masses of Muslims portrayed through news media. How might this be different? How does one communicate across cultures to multiple populations? The model of perceptual culture offers a means of tailoring such solutions by learning from rather than about each culture. By investigating how a wide range of texts in the Islamic world, including the Quran, as well as theology, philosophy, and poetry, my research discovers paradigms of perception that circulate over a wide range of places and times, suggesting a perceptual culture integral to historic Islam, but not restricted to it. This way of engaging the world provides a different means of taking in culture than that which dominates modernity. This engagement depends on the idea that knowledge of the world is never objective, but always subjective. This is because we take in information based on our conditioning through the experience of interacting with the world. In Islamic discourses, this conditioning takes place through the heart. Known as the renewer of the faith, the much beloved scholar Muhammad al-Ghazali describes this in his Persian language, Alchemy of Happiness. The first step to self-knowledge is to know that thou art composed of an outward shape called the body and an inward entity called the heart or soul. By heart, I do not mean the piece of flesh situated in the left of our bodies, but that which uses all the other faculties as instruments and servants. In truth, it does not belong to the visible world, but to the invisible, and has come into this world as a traveler visits a foreign country for the sake of merchandise, and will presently return to its native land. It is the knowledge of this entity and its attributes which is the key to the knowledge of God. We also condition the heart through stories. Through stories, we gain wonder. Wonder becomes the substrate through which we derive questions that can be satisfied with knowledge. In this process, Islam shifts from being the unknown, external to the museum-going self. It becomes the repository of multiple stories that, when they are taken in, bring familiarity with the ones who tell them. Museums, as we know them, address the outward senses. Yet, if we want to engage culture, we need to also condition the inward ones, which will then inform the outer ones about how to take in the world, particularly aspects of the world about which we do not already possess knowledge. As proposed by Aristotle and other Platonists, and inherited in Islamic thought, conditioning functions best not through direct information, but through indirect representations. In Islamic thought, these include music and geometry, suggesting a model of the image distinct from that dominant in modernity. It also includes the experiences that we derive from love. One thing I very much appreciate about this modern commissioned wall that is located at the Doris Duke Foundation in Hawaii is how it replicates the kind of experience that one might have if one were placed in the world of manuscript paintings. And so, though it doesn't tell a story, it involves the body inside of an experience which invites a story. The example of the Doris Duke Foundation brings up the issue of the museum, not as a place that necessarily imparts only direct knowledge, but the museum as a space of affectivity. This is central to the ways in which certain kinds of images in the Islamic world provide knowledge, that is, they open the soul. We can see this in the discourses of the Brethren of Purity as they describe the way in which geometry and music function in terms of informing the subject. Know, O brother, that the study of sensible geometry aids skillfulness in the arts, whilst the study of intellective geometry and the knowledge of the properties of numbers and figures helps in grasping the manner by which the heavenly bodies affect the lower natural entities, and also in understanding how the sounds of music affect the souls of the listeners. Those who study intellective geometry have a way to reach knowledge of it through God's aid and guidance. The Brethren understood the imagination as regulating a flow of knowledge from the senses towards abstraction. As a result, geometry, or in a broader sense, rhythm, including rhythms in nature or music, enabled a subject to become increasingly open to concepts of theology. What's interesting from our perspective is less this openness to the divine than the idea that the object is itself an agent. And this brings me back to Shedhal's impression that the objects were looking at him. This effect is taking place without an intermediary theorization. How can a museum come to use that? I would like to make this a lot more concrete by looking at the label of an object that's at the Metropolitan Museum of Art. Now, the kinds of information we get on this label involve location, history, trade, stylistic influence, cultural exchange. But the thing is, none of these categories would have been familiar to somebody encountering this object on a wall at the time that it was in use. As a result, we don't even learn very much about that culture or about Chinese culture or Islamic culture. What we learn is about modern historical culture. So how else might we understand this object? The matter with the Simurgh, oh miracle, began once to disclose itself in China. A feather fell down from her in the midst of China, whereupon turmoil seized the whole country. Everybody who procured himself an image of that feather, and whosoever beheld the image, started to act. This feather is thus in the picture gallery of China. Seek knowledge, be it even from China. If the image of her feather had not disclosed itself, this uproar would not be in the world. All these works of creation are there because of her radiance. All images stem from the image of her feather. But since her description has neither beginning nor end, it is not befitting to speak more about her. So here we have a very different approach to the idea of the label. We bring in the viewer through a story about a feather. And somehow this feather is related to the image, but in a rather lateral way. In Islamic cultures, people weren't communicating about Islam dominantly by going to court or by engaging with the law. Instead, Islam circulated in poetry like this. By allowing for an encounter with such a poem, we begin to introduce somebody to an idea of the image which is distinct from our own, in which the image is never capable of representing. At the same time, for a knowledgeable viewer, or perhaps with the effective mediation of a museum, we can come to see how this poetry isn't simply religion or culture, but instead lies between these two intrennable things. Rather, this kind of a poem teaches people how to take in Islam in a way that doesn't say, this is a religion that's different from yours, or this is a religion that belongs to you. This approach allows one to stop taking a defensive posture against misinformation, which is constantly repeated, and instead introduce a new way of understanding things, which doesn't restrict everything into the binary of yes and no, and instead invites us to think about what is an image and why do we care about it so passionately? In fact, who is this we, and how might this we be constructed differently? This also has implications for the role of the museum. When the museum functions less as a place for disseminating information and more of a place for engaging the perception of the viewer, the experience of the museum expands, including multiple senses and experiences. Rather than sidelining these experiences as programming or education, the central experience of the museum needs to take account of the body and pleasure of the viewer. We need to reconceive our sense of teaching through the museum so that it neither answers questions on an invisible exam that never arrives, nor alienates viewers in other ways. For example, by boring them with information that they're not conditioned to take in. The teaching practice of the museum has to develop a pedagogy that becomes a process of conditioning, inviting questions. Like discourses on music in Islam, inherited from the Platonic tradition, the work has to enter the soul of the visitor before information can acquire a home and acquire meaning. This kind of pedagogy would enable us as museum goers to move outside of a position which is outside and above the world, and instead explore the world through multiple perceptual cultures. From the perspective of European habits of perceiving, Islamic arts are still often conceived through a sequence of lacks. The lack of the representational image, the lack of iconographic meaning, the lack of perspective, and even the lack of art when things that we might think of as art are conceived as craft or ethnographic objects. Yet in what that European perspective perceives as lack lies a presence. This presence is best modeled, I think, by pattern itself, which invites us to move the place from which we look. Some days, the feather through which we reflect the simurg understands through a mindset that might be European. Other days, our feather might be Islamic, or Chinese, or Igbo, or Inuit. By lacking a single perspective and being able to slide between the different nodes of a pattern like this, we as subjects become liberated to perceive the world in multiple ways, none of which takes precedence over the other, and all of which necessarily mutually respect each other. Thinking through my book in the context of the museum becomes an institution that is not designed to invite knowledge or empathy or sympathy. It does not aim to humanize the other who should already by default be human. Instead, it allows the visitor to recondition the self, expanding to a multiplicity of selves, It becomes a source of freedom in which we can engage with that which we do not know, less through our minds or even our well-meaning hearts, but through conditioning that enables actual engagement, communication, and genuine mutual affection.
Oh, I just want to say it's almost impossible to summarize my book. So I don't know if I did an okay. Oh, wait, I'm trying to get my video back. Start video. Yeah. So I don't know if I summarized it, but hopefully I raised a few points.
Absolutely, that was fantastic. Thank you, Wendy. And how this will go now is I'm going to invite our respondents, so Pooyan and Mirjam. So first, Pooyan will speak for 15 minutes, and then Mirjam will speak for 15 minutes. And I invite everyone to submit questions into the Q&A while this goes on. We'll have a short discussion after that, and I will then bring all those questions to the floor and we can discuss them together. So Pooyan, I will leave it to you now.
Thank you. Welcome everybody. Thank you for connecting to this book presentation and discussion today, wherever you are, in whatever time zone you are. Reading this book, I have it right here. What is Islamic Art Between Religion and Perception has been a pleasure, especially because of the small gems the book contains, such as an analysis of a miniature painting. You could have just seen it, on which Plato is depicted as a version of Orpheus playing music, putting animals to sleep, or an analysis of the prophet Mani, whose art of painting was not only heretical, but became known as a form of wisdom through the poetry of Nizami, or erotic transgressions, as in depictions of the story of Yusuf and Zulaykha. And finally, in connecting Islamic geometry to a philosophical and scientific tradition to which Ibn Haytham and Ibn Sina belonged. So I haven't even begun to describe the book and dropped some names already. This is not my fault, because Wendy Shaw's book, as we read on the very, I believe the very last page, offers, quote, complex more than simple pleasures. So from the cover and the title, you may be deceived to think that this will be an easy read, but to be able to read the book critically, one needs knowledge of philosophy, art history, Sufi poetry, but also contemporary studies of secularism. So it's a book by an art historian for art historians and other academic elites. What does that mean for museums and their visitors? Well, we just saw an example of how you could exhibit some of these objects. And I will also get into that with one or two examples myself in a moment. Now, let me say something first about how I read the book and what I believe it's about. Shaw sets out, as we've also heard, to correct some limitations in the discipline of art history to better appreciate Islamic art and material culture. Modern categories such as art or the secular, that's how the argument goes, can prevent us from understanding the importance of perception for past Islamic worlds. I read this as a plea to put more effort into understanding the styles of Islamic art. For example, made in the Ottoman Empire, under the Seljuks and Safavids, or in the Mughal Empire. But with styles, I don't just mean the styles of making objects, such as different styles of painting, but styles of reasoning, styles of perceiving, ways of being in the world. Wendy just used also the word in the presentation, episteme and paradigm. We could also describe it as perception styles, right? There are different perception styles that we need to make our own. The criticism is that in the book is that despite libraries being full of academic works about the Quran, on Islamic law, philosophy, Sufi poetry, Still, very little of this is used actually in art history when wanting to interpret a miniature painting or the geometric forms on the surface of a mosque. This reminds of Shahab Ahmed's criticism of Clifford Geertz in What is Islam?, where Ahmed writes that Geertz did a cultural anthropology of Islam without taking the trouble to immerse himself into what Ahmed called the continent of meaning, represented by vast archives of texts that are necessary to understand both objects and practices used and practiced in Islamic past and presence. So while Shaw's criticism may be de facto to the point, perhaps also if we look at how art history is organized institutionally in various universities in Europe and North America, I am less worried about lacking the conceptual and methodological approaches to dealing with Islamic art and material culture. For the discipline of art history, long knows about hermeneutics, of course. This is not theorized in the book, but I think that as I take Shaw to be doing actually hermeneutics. She writes, for example, about the perceptual culture she wants to study. She writes the following, quote, emerging through discursive conditioning, perceptual culture reflects reception rather than production. By immersing ourselves in discourse, this analytic practice enables a sort of time travel. We can step into a discursive framework through which to perceive the world otherwise, while also not letting go of the attitudes and analyses that seem natural to us as moderns. So it's crucial here that she also adds the not letting go of the attitudes and analyses that seem natural to us as moderns. Studying Islamic art history does not negate our present, but it can change who we are and want to be. In hermeneutics, you do not simply learn about another culture. We saw this also in the presentation. But what happens is that your horizon is changed. The process of interpretation is one of learning from cultures, as Shaw concludes. So what is there to learn? I can give an everyday example from the time I worked for the National Museum of World Cultures. So one day, I was giving a tour to museum teachers who had to go through the entire museum with high school kids, and they had to do it very fast. So one of the objects we stopped to look at was a Mughal miniature painting of the Prophet Muhammad on display at the Museum Volkenkunde that was in Leiden. In this painting, the Prophet is veiled, but the veil is translucent. So if you look carefully, his face can still be seen. The teachers asked me, is it because the artist wanted to explore the limitations placed by the Islamic Bilderverbot? Their question is understandable, right? They're trying to make sense of what they're seeing. But they're looking into their own archive of art historical knowledge and considering that perhaps the artist was being avant-garde, pushing taboos with the translucent veil. The problem with this is, to cite Shaw, that such attempts to pin down the meaning of the veil reflect modern expectations more than discussions of the image in Islamic thought. So in other words, a focus on the image prohibition on Bilderverbot works against understanding the meaning of the image for its past users. Even to call the painting an image of the Prophet is already to change it. Similarly, to not show paintings, for example, out of respect for Muslim school children, would be part of an Orientalist vision of Islam as essentially iconoclastic. I agree fully with Shaw that museums' use of such paintings, either by showing them or not showing them, to undermine prejudice is problematic. The ideals of living together amicably and cohesion serve integration into nations. They do not serve a good historical understanding of art and material culture that can be called Islamic. So how should the images be interpreted? Shaw's book repeats a Platonic notion of mediation in several examples. Put abstractly, quote, materiality is necessary, right? Materiality is necessary because its balanced perception enables apprehension of God. Or, for example, in another page, she writes, only through it, so the image, can reflection enable access to hidden truth. Shaw shows that a very simple object like a mirror box, one, for example, in the Tropenmuseum collection, is tied to a centuries-old esoteric understanding of the mirror mediating access to the divine. And I have a picture of it, if I can share screen for a second. Yeah, so this is a mirror box in the Tropenmuseum collection. And when you open the box, one side shows a mirror, the other shows a depiction of Imam Ali. This was a portable object used to practice devotion and the Zikr Ali, the concentrated repetition of Ali's name, one of the 99 names of God also. Shaw's book helps the curator of this object understand how the mirror is tied to the tradition, as in Rumi, where it is a metaphor for the true and beautiful and divine. The mirror symbolizes the unification of the practicing Sufi, Ali in this case, and God as the subject of meditation. Ali is not veiled simply to cover the face, but to reveal through meditation his true spiritual face, to learn to see with the heart instead of one's eyes. In a Turkish poem by the Sufi poet Hilmi Dedebaba, this process is described literally. It goes something like this: I held a mirror before my face. Ali appeared in my eyes. I watched myself and Ali appeared in my face. So let me just stop sharing this. Yeah. So in this practice, the image is the surface behind which the true prophet, or in this case, the true Ali, can be found. Shaw shows how the interpretations of both image and mirror tie with a history of Muslim thinking about the painting skills of the West in Rome and the mirrors made in the East in China. Such practices of mediation can also involve pleasure and humor, music and drinking. Like Shahab Ahmad, Shaw seems to particularly appreciate the transgressive nature of these types of objects, as can be deduced from her implicit reference to Plato's Symposium as a way of doing art history, being with each other, drinking, and speaking about love and the good, and learning in the process. That is because in the style of reasoning and perceiving that she describes, sensory pleasure is a means to the divine. She writes, sensory pleasures inform love of the divine because transcendence requires materiality. This can be a person too. Yusuf's beauty, Shaw writes about a love story, signals divine beauty. So we know this, of course, from Plato's dialogue Phaedrus, to which she refers actually very often. Love can be found in the eye of the lover rather than in the beloved. When the lover sees the beloved, his shoulders become soft and moisty so that wings can grow from them that allow for reaching transcendence. However, and this is crucial to get Plato's sensuality, if we lose sight of the beloved on earth, our wings dry up and we fall back to earth. Earthly love is dangerous, but it is a bridge to the divine. Similarly, drinking intoxicating wine can arouse the mania, the madness that is required for Platonic love for both the earthly beloved and God. Now, what Shaw does not make very explicit is that the Muslim painters, the philosophers, and the Sufi poets were engaged with a hierarchical epistemology. How does this hierarchical epistemology relate to the museum as a democratic, as an egalitarian institution. What may appear comical or transgressive for ignorant outsiders may in fact turn out to be a means to get to the divine and be part of an Islamic perceptual culture. In short, these objects require intellectual effort. Museums can facilitate access to these objects. They can, change their exhibition styles. They can help us get the books that we need to help understand the objects. But this is a hermeneutic process that in the end requires patience. In a way, I would want to say that Shaw's book is a plea for not projecting only our own views onto the objects, but to have patience and to stand still so that they can change who we are. And that was what I had to say so far. I think.
Thank you very much, Pooyan.
Yes, thank you for taking over.
Those thought-provoking ideas, but I'll leave my many questions until after Mirjam speaks. So I'll give the floor now to Mirjam Shatanawi.
Yeah, thank you, Wendy, for your book. I read it over the summer and on holiday, actually. So I had a great time at the swimming pool reading your book. And it engages with many things that I was, it engages with many things that I've been struggling with when I was a curator at the National Museum of World Cultures. And I want to respond to you from that perspective, because it's a different kind of museum and it engages with Islamic culture more than Islamic art. And I want to see how your book can contribute to this kind of museum too, because if I have one criticism, if I have any, then it is that it is still focusing a lot on what is classified as Islamic art. And there is so much more. I'm very happy that you also show examples from music, for instance, which is not often seen as Islamic art. Yeah, Islamic art, I have a kind of love-hate relationship with that field, which I want to explain first before I go on. Because yeah, in this museum we have a large Middle East collection, but an even much larger Indonesian collection, of course. And there is a conflation of Islam and the Middle East in this museum, like in many museums. But we also see the opposite, that the collections from Indonesia were not actually almost never considered as Islamic. And as we have seen from the map that you've shown from the Metropolitan Museum, Indonesia doesn't really exist in the field of Islamic art. And I think it's very interesting because many of the issues that pop up in your book are challenged when you look at Indonesian art of culture. And what the main problem is here is that the notion of Islamic art as it developed in the early 20th century is recursive. So it's self-affirming in many ways. Art historians set the parameters for what should be Islamic art and then use it as a benchmark to select what they would study. And in doing so, they produced much of the material culture that was produced by Muslims or for Muslims. Actually, I think the share of material culture that was ignored by historians of Islamic art is much larger than the share that was considered. So what was ignored were the collections of ethnographic museums, meaning that art that was produced outside the urban centers. The 19th century was entirely ignored for a long period, and large regions like Southeast Asia or Sub-Saharan Africa. I'm very happy that this is changing now in the past few years. But what is the real problem here is that Islamic art defined the Islamic in a way that applied a universal scope and a universal reach. So the idea of Islamic art was that there was a visual program that developed from Islam from the early years and then spread everywhere where Islam came. And this idea of the unity of Islamic art aligns, of course, very much with the idea of Islamic modernism that defines Islam as universal and united. But yeah, like I said before, even though the definition implied universalism, at the same time, the scope of Islamic art as I was studying was extremely limited. So the problem of art history is very similar to the issue of many Muslims today, is a one central benchmark to measure Islam. Or is there the university, is there one true Islam, or are there many Islams? And these are ideas that developed in the 19th century and early 20th century under colonialism. And Ann Stoler has used the notion of durability to look at the capacity of colonial ideas to endure and take on new forms in the present. And she speaks of colonial presence, so the ramification of colonialism that's continued to shape the present conditions. And we see that very much in museums and in how Islamic art is classified, in the hierarchy that there still is between what is art and in art museums and what is ethnology and what is in ethnology museums. But we also see it in the vocabulary that developed, for instance, and now I return to Indonesia. In this museum, they use the AAT, this is the Art and Architecture Thesaurus that is developed by the Getty Trust in the USA. And this is a thesaurus that's used in many museums to designate keywords to objects. And Indonesian Islamic art simply doesn't exist in the AAT. There is literally no vocabulary to discuss it. So there are material, technological obstacles to that come from this colonial legacy. And we also see it in the way up till today, how I will share this. Yeah. How we look at Indonesian art and Iranian art, for example. What we see in Indonesian art, that much of the art that's produced in the Muslim period has incorporates Hindu themes. So there are stories, images, practices that originate in Hinduism that have been reproduced and reinterpreted in these Indonesian art forms. This is dance, theater, but also the visual arts. And to me, this is very similar to Iran, where the legacy of pre-Islamic religion and culture also plays a significant role. We've looked at a few of these miniature paintings before. But the European perceptions, and this arises from colonialism and ideas about race and culture and development and tradition and modernity and all these things. And this is diametrically opposed. There's no doubt by art historians that Iranian paintings of pre-Islamic themes are Islamic. But in the case of Indonesia, this phenomenon is read as evidence that Indonesians are only nominally Islamic. And this has to do with the way Islamic art history developed, that the aesthetics of Indonesian art do not fit the category of Islamic art. So that's the reason it's excluded from this supposedly universal category. So there's a paradox there. This is a long introduction into the gaps and limitations of art history, because it resonates very much with what you discuss in your book. How can I get back to this? Yeah. only getting worse. Okay. And the alternatives you suggest, because I think that many of the things you address are also very useful to look at other segments of Islamic culture, for instance, at Indonesian art, but also to look at the ethnographic collections and a wider field of Islamic culture. And especially the idea of the Islamic and the perceptual culture, which you discussed already today. I think this is very relevant for Southeast Asia, not only because the Islamic finds expression there in music, theater, and dance. This is the same, of course, in the Middle East, which has a strong legacy of poetry and storytelling that is largely ignored in Islamic art, as you rightly say. And in this kind of museum, at least, attempts were made to capture intangible heritage through sound recordings, music, and film. I think of the work of Christian Snoeker-Gonje. Who in 1885 made sound recordings of the Azan and musical performances in Jeddah. And in your book, you give some great examples of how art is a sensory experience in many cases. And then when we go to museums, what your book shows very well is how the focus on objects, on the material and the tangible is seriously limiting our understanding of the Islamic. And that often the connection with the wider context, the discursive culture of Islam was lost. And in the art museum, we see this because of this focus on styles and dynasties and patronage and form. But in the ethnographic museum, we see it because function and meaning were at the core of interpretation. But this was often approached as face value. For instance, the Indonesian wayang puppets that I showed, they were seen as remnants of a Hindu past, but rather than considering how come that Muslims used these centuries on later and how they were repurposed in an Islamic philosophical or literary environment. And there are many academic publications who discuss this, but these academic discussions did not reach the museum. These interpretations continue to be at face value. So we see a Hindu god, so this is what it depicts, rather than see what this Hindu god means in an Islamic context. And the same for art history. They didn't look further than the Asian appearance of these wayang puppets, rather than asking the question, what does it mean that the Islamic here is expressed in an Asian aesthetic, and what does it tell us about the universality of Islamic art? And to give another example, at the moment I'm working on flags from Indonesia, which have the Zulfikar symbol, so the double-edged sword that was also on the mirror painting, the sword that's associated with the Prophet Muhammad and his cousin Ali. And in colonial sources, these flags were interpreted the sword as a jihadist call for war. And all the other meanings were simply ignored. It has, for instance, a spiritual meaning. The sword pops up in Sufi poetry in different places. And in Southeast Asia, we find it as a meditation image used in zikr, in the remembrance of God. But also in Southeast Asian literature, the sword is a mystical motif that's, for instance, found in the Hikayat Amir Hamza, and in an Achinese text called Wasit Nabi, in which we find the story of Fatima, the daughter of the Prophet Muhammad, who talks with a sword. So it's a talking sword. But this is actually, this is quite a sexist and very, text that's very unfriendly to women. So it's also a symbol of male dominance, I would say here. But the most important thing here regarding your book is that the sword is a visual relic. So through the sword, the Prophet Muhammad is spiritually present wherever the flag goes. So this is a presence that is embodied, and that can be felt through other senses than the eye. And yeah, in connection to this, I have two questions. One, I can read from this story of Fatima, but it's quite awful. In what sense should we read your book? Because all the examples you give are quite philosophical and beautiful, and they approach art still as something beautiful. So how is it situated in a debate about Islam, and how is it also a defense about, of Islam in a way? And how should the museum address this? Because this discursive context is not always beautiful and nice. It's sometimes quite nasty. And the second question, I have this embodied experience is so hard. I'm afraid the museum or any place is not the place to be able to convey this, because it demands a present in a certain moment. And I'm not sure if that's in any way possible, but yeah, let's discuss it. Okay, thank you.
Pooyan as well, and I invite Pooyan and Wendy to turn their video and microphones back on. And I think, Mirjam, you already posed a question, which I think I'd like to start with since it's fresh on our minds. So yeah, how do we deal with non-beautiful texts? And I think that's a really interesting question to begin with.
So I'm gonna thank you both for really interesting takes on it. And yeah, I'm sort of processing everything that you've said. So I think my answer is going to bring up that question definitely, but also touch on a few things that both Pooyan and Mirjam mentioned. First of all, this was a vast, vast topic. So, and it was already too vast. So really what I was trying to do was look at some sort of very mainstream texts that haven't really been read from this perspective and use them as sources of analysis. The range of texts one could go through would be vast, and that is always a selective process. So one of the issues that came up, which Pooyan brought up at the beginning, was that it's complicated. And the thing is, it's complicated because one's entering into another worldview. So once I became more facile in the worldview, it became less complicated for me because I was more separated from the way I'm accustomed to thinking. But obviously thinking in a different way is complicated. So returning to Mirjam's question, I think one of the things I would keep in mind is that when addressing texts, there are things that are disturbing, beautiful, non-beautiful, and so on in the stories. And there are also the multiple narrative interpretations of those stories and the ways in which those have been processed into the Islamic world. So for me, it would be a mistake to look directly at a narrative that is not a historical narrative, but a poetic narrative, and take it for what it is, because it's also been processed, depending on where it emerges and how it circulates, in multiple ways in the culture. And I think one of the things that you pointed to extremely effectively is, for me, one of the shortcomings of the way in which we talk about Islamic art is that we focus on the form, first of all. So as you pointed out, we look at certain formal qualities that define the Islamic, which end up being very exclusive. And we also think of form that extends to how we think of religious divisions. So there's something called Islam, and as you pointed out, there's something called Hinduism. Now, unfortunately, in the scope of my book, that was one relationship I didn't have a chance to write, partially because I think that would be an entire book on its own. I'm sure it would be at least one book, probably many more. The thing is that the issue of the form of the categories is a problem because, as you so rightly point out, the intellectual forms aren't separate. People were always in communication. And so for me, the question has to become, how do we enter into the intellectual world of another culture and time in order to give meaning to perceptual culture. And I'm saying perceptual culture, you brought up material culture, but as you also indicated, I think that the focus on materiality itself, while it's necessary, the matter isn't always physical things. And so I want to keep bringing that up because it can be something like a dream, it could be music, as you mentioned. So what I think we need to think about is how does one choose in relation to the museum in particular, is not so much is one choosing the beautiful or the non-beautiful, but how does one take a complicated intellectual world and use an object as a funnel through which to engage with these ideas, which are different, which are alien? And how does one use that difference to allow for a different way of seeing? And for that, I really loved the example that Pooyan brought up with that wonderful mirror, because it allows a very different relationship with the self and the other and the object of worship than we can accommodate within the notion of the image that we bring to the museum. So yeah, I think that's really the issue for me, is how does that becomes the hardest in the museum, is how does one communicate or inspire somebody to, even for a moment, step outside of their existing categories. And for me, as somebody teaching, the most effective way of doing that has been actually to either use music, just have people listen to music and think about the music as an experience, or to tell stories and use them as parables and talk about the ways in which those stories have circulated and been interpreted, so that they keep opening up rather than closing down into a single definition.
I want to follow up on that and ask, I think, a challenging question that both Mirjam and Pooyan brought up, and I see also in the question, and whether the museum, Pooyan mentioned patience, and I think that's a really interesting point, that this takes patience. And the question is, do you think that the museum is a space that can realistically do this, provide this kind of space for experience to understand a different mode of perception?
I think, as Pooyan pointed out, I don't have an illusion that we can become something other than what we are. That is, we are all moderns and we're conditioned by modern forms of knowledge. So I think that the museum can enable somebody to see that they're not seeing all aspects of something, and maybe to have an encounter that's outside of what's within their normal range. So in terms of, I'm also looking at the question that Priya Swami raised here, is this a religious experience? I would put forth that the museum itself, far from being a neutral space, is a space that's already conditioned by Christian European modes of practice in which one meditates with an object through the active vision. That is, and there's a history, of course, to the taking of objects from particular sites that are private or that are religious and placing them in the museum for what becomes a space of secularized ritual, in the words of Carol Duncan, or as kind of secularized spirituality. So for me, the boundary between the religious and the spiritual and the secular are very complex, and they really have to do with how the ideology of the museum and the ideology of the modern coincide. So the museum is already doing this, but just as I'm saying, the fish doesn't see its own water, we don't see that ideology as being connected to one cultural religious practice. And I don't think we can really separate that in Europe any more than we can separate it in the Islamic world. So is that the place for the museum? It's already doing it. It's just doing it within a Eurocentric context. That's not a criticism. It's natural that it should do so. But I think that when we're engaging with a multiplicity of cultures, and as Pooyan pointed out, trying to engage with them on an even footing, it's very important to remember that when we're looking at the Christian European tradition, we know all this intellectual substrate. We go to the museum already carrying this with us, or we're expected to already know it. That's sort of the baseline of knowledge. When we go into a different experience, it's as if none of this there was no intellectual world here. And so we're taking all of this, trying to fill it up into this, and it's somehow not matching. And so the question for me is two things. One of them is it's actually not the case that all museum goers know this stuff. Increasingly, people don't know very much about Christianity. And in countries with high rates of migration, the people who've migrated often don't know about the European Christian context. So this premise of what we know and how we engage with the museum can actually be very alienating to immigrant populations, working class populations. That is, in both cases, the museum has to think about how does it mediate what you're supposed to already know about a culture before you encounter the object. And that's a much bigger question, of course, but I wouldn't necessarily say that, that it's secular already or that this is more complicated. I think complicated has to do with what our original subject position is.
Thank you. Yeah, I'm wondering along those lines, then do you think that perhaps the modes of display should be different for each, also regionally? I'm thinking, then based on context, should Chinese objects then be displayed and given different context from objects from Iran, let's say?
That's a great question. And I feel bad criticizing curators because I don't want to be criticizing curators. I know that curators are doing the best they can with a lot of constraints. And those constraints include what there is in collections, what boards of directors expect, what the audience expects, all sorts of time, money. There's a lot there. So it's very hard to say should. And I want to start out prefacing anything with that, because I often feel bad that I'm like, you're doing it all wrong. And I don't mean it that way. I mean, there's an interface problem, and that runs a danger. So I'm trying to sort of foray a way of maybe dealing with it, but other people will have other ideas, and that's useful. The point is to think, okay, there's something that's not functioning when people go to a museum, and regularly people say, well, that was pretty, but I didn't learn anything about Islam. And then an Islamic art historian says, well, Islam isn't really the point. And then they're sitting there and there's a disconnect. And as Mirjam points out, what's the gap between the objects? How do we understand carpets, for example? How do we understand tiles that were purchased as examples of industrial design in the 19th century and then remodel them to an understanding of culture? What does all this mean? So in terms of the more practical aspect of your question, probably one thing I would do if I had all the freedom in the world and all the time and all the money, is I would want museums to use fewer objects in a more focused way. That is, I think that many collections have a plethora of objects, and because of this plethora, there needs to be an overarching theme that can include many things. And I think that sometimes it might be useful to tell stories in a small way that people can pay attention to, in a way that takes more time with each object and idea, and which doesn't overwhelm the senses. A completely other way of doing it would be to completely overwhelm the senses and include things like tea and music and smells, and sort of think about how objects would be engaged with space. And perhaps in my ideal imaginary super wealthy museum, there would be a reason to come back because the exhibits and the exhibit strategies would be multiple and changing. Now, you said, would China be doing it differently than the Islamic world? All of this depends on the story you're telling, right? So for me, really, the main issue is, how do you use objects as nodes in storytelling? Because we're always storytelling. And how can we change the matrix of those stories? Pooyan mentioned that I talk about Phaedrus strangely a lot in this book. And that's because I have another book that's coming out in May, hopefully, which is called Loving Writing. It will be coming out from Routledge. And it's about writing through a Platonic lens. So a lot of what I learned in this book is in that book, but it's not Islamic in that book because it was a matter of how do you learn from. So, you know, that's not going to be limited to what I've learned from, but I hope that other people will think of ways of learning from that are beyond where I am right now.
Thanks. I want to draw back to the museum again and talk a little bit about audience, because I think that follows up on what you were saying. And I also on what Mirjam was talking about, because what's really made an impression on me and what Mirjam touched on is how different the ethnographic context is from the Metropolitan Museum, because here in these pictures you showed in your presentation, the point, they're often pushing away from Islam, as you said. They're trying to separate culture from religion, whatever that means. With the ethnographic collections, they're imposing a sort of single Islam onto all collections from the Middle East region, let's say. To take one example, Indonesia is obviously very different. And so that's a very different kind of perception and move. And so I'm curious if you have any thoughts specifically about ethnographic collections and audience, because often the idea is that these kinds of perceptions will just be targeting quote unquote Muslim visitors. And of course that leads to complications.
Yeah, I mean, I think that the thing is that for me, what I really learned in delving into these texts is that they're very distinct from each other. That is, they share certain things, they share certain premises, but they're diverse, they emerge in different voices. And I think that that's a way of thinking about Islam outside of this idea that it's all one thing. That is, the idea of one thing, that Islam is a singularity, is more on the conceptual level of monotheism. But that everybody is doing the same thing all the time is literally not possible, right? And so I think that a great example is actually the one that Pooyan brought up, in which that quotation by a poet gives insight to how somebody would experience that mirror. To give another example, at the Ethnographic Museum here in Berlin, when it was still open, I was visiting one day and there was a very large group of objects from Sufi shrines. And there was a man there who looked like he was from somewhere that wasn't German. And it turned out he was from Bangladesh. And I asked him, he was the guard. And I said, you know, what's your favorite work in the museum? And he showed me these works from Sufi shrines. And then he told me, and this was really a very touching story, that his family was back home and that his only sort of way of being in touch with his family was through his sheikh, and that he had a picture of his sheikh on his telephone through which he would think through his sheikh and feel closer to the divine. And that he felt a closeness to these objects from shrines because of his own practice as a Sufi. Now, he's somebody who often wouldn't be in the museums in Berlin. And of course, this is something that I think is very different in terms of how museums engage with museum goers in Berlin as opposed to in the Netherlands, though I haven't lived in the Netherlands, so it's impossible for me to speak to. But I think that that way of thinking about how one can use different conversations and different poems to shed light on objects and use that as sort of the through line of an exhibit, rather than an imposed category like Islam or China or dynasty. That might be a way of moving away from the limitations that are imposed by the museum. In a recent article that Mirjam read in a book that she's editing, I had a kind of funny idea, and I don't know if it's realistic again, right? During the initial shutdown from COVID, my daughter wasn't feeling well, so we were playing Dobble every day. And Dobble is a matching game in which there are different categories on each card, and one of them will always match. And I thought about, what if a museum had one category matching and then the category shifted and then the category shifted? Because isn't that how we live our lives? And, you know, I think we can just think about different mathematical models through which we can tell stories.
Amazing. Thank you. We'll just leave it open now to if Mirjam and Pooyan want to add anything else before we open it to questions from the audience.
I think you can just go ahead.
Great. I want to ask you about the matching game, but we can do that afterwards.
With you.
So we have a few questions here. I will start with one about, I was wondering if you could comment on the presentation of Islamic art in Islamic countries and institutions where these might offer alternatives. I'm thinking particularly of the Louvre Abu Dhabi, and wondering if there was any prior consultations about the presentation.
To the best of my knowledge, the Louvre Abu Dhabi doesn't have Islamic art, but there's an Islamic museum in Doha. Is that I think probably this
we can maybe talk about that
mixed
one.
it up a little bit, but I'll talk about the Islamic Museum in Doha, and I've only seen photographs. I haven't been there. Okay, so, you know, everything I'm saying is provisional, and I apologize to people in Doha or anybody who's been there. From the pictures that I've seen and from the maps, there seems to be an adoption of the general overarching narrative of the spread of Islam. So a story of origins that moves forward in time. Now, these museums are quite complicated in that they have enormous purchasing power. And there's an issue, of course, of whom they're addressing. Are they addressing local audiences? Are they addressing international audiences and showing those international audiences Islamic culture? But the Islamic culture is also, as Mirjam pointed out, still very much focused in the historic regions of Islam surrounding the Mediterranean. And so there's a gap there that doesn't always reflect the Gulf, but there's also an issue of, I see the Gulf museums as being very parallel to something like the Metropolitan Museum of Art, in which they purchased European culture after World War II because they could. And so there's a place called the Cloisters, which is a European cloister taken to New York, and it's part of a taking of the old world into the new. So as far as I know, the museum in Doha also emphasizes the jewel box aspect, the beautiful aspect of Islamic art. One area where there may be a distinction is the ways in which they engage with writing arts, because people are actually reading the texts. And that's something, of course, that's very different from the presentation of writing arts in European and museums in the West, because most people won't be able to access the texts. And even if the texts are present, they won't have the cultural knowledge through which to understand how to think about those texts. One museum, which at least online I've found at times very good about explaining texts, is actually the Aga Khan Museum in Toronto, which is quite closely connected with the Ismaili community. And that's also a very interesting case, because they're also not changing the overall narrative as such, but in the details, there seems to be somewhat more attention to how meaning is produced. And one of my doctoral students, Philip Geisler, is working on it, and he's been impressed at how different communities are brought into the museum. So one thing to keep in mind, though, and this is what really makes it complicated, is that the story of origins and growth and spread is not only the dominant European way of thinking about the history of Islam, it's the dominant modern way of thinking about Islam. And so what I'm proposing isn't, hey, Muslims think about the past differently. It's that through modernity, we've moved away from a lot of the ways of understanding Islam that were present in the pre-modern period. And that is often true for people who are practicing Muslims, as well as people who are from cultures that have been at some point part of hegemonic Islam. That is, in the United States, we read Shakespeare. In Turkey, we don't read the equivalent of Shakespeare the same way. That's no longer valid for our culture. And in a way, that's what I'm trying to do.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point about these categorizations. And also this question of literacy of the material, I think is really interesting in terms of reading, because calligraphy, poetry is often displayed in museums in the form of calligraphy in Arabic or in Persian. And you know, there's a kind of assumption of illegibility, which I think is interesting. And I know many other people have written about this, but I think we should think about that more critically. I have a lot more questions coming in. So there's one about, which I think you mostly answered, about categorization and whether if we're going to shift away from colonial epistemologies, do we necessarily need to shift away from these labels and classifications?
I think that one gets into a problem that classifications are always provisional. That is, there was a point in writing this book that I thought that the perfect title for it would be Islamic scratched out, art scratched out, history scratched out. And I've noticed that I really annoy my students because I'm constantly like, well, we can't really talk about art and we can't really talk about visual culture, and religion is a problematic term. And then, you know, you just said calligraphy. And I'm like, well, calligraphy is a Western term from the 18th century and it refers to visual beauty, but khat is the trace. And when we think of writing as a trace of the scribe, we end up with a whole different world. So there's a danger, there's a use and a danger, because language is categories. And so when we fiddle with categories excessively, we lose language and we lose the capacity to communicate. But when we don't recognize that categories are provisional and problematic and limiting, then we also lose information. So what I think I brought up at the end of my presentation is that I would like us to become practiced in shifting our subjectivity, so that just like I can shift on a dime and speak different languages, I can also use multiple techniques of analysis. I can use multiple modes of categorization. And I think that in our educations, we're taught to memorize categories and put information in it. But I think that we could also learn to be more flexible and more mobile in situating ourselves, and allow for the fact that we can understand things through one set of categories, but then an alternative set of categories will give us a different understanding. And both of these are valid. I'm not going to say I learned nothing from Islamic art history. Most of my sources are either poetry and, you know, philosophical texts and so on, or they're from Islamic art historians. And there are some amazing texts coming out in Islamic art history. That isn't the only way I want to think about things. And of course, what art history is also changes. I, like Mirjam, have a huge love-hate relationship with Islamic art history. But the point being, I learn stuff from it, and I can learn things about the same materials differently from the Islamic discourses. They're not mutually exclusive. And so I think that in relation to categories, it's a long question, so I can't sort of read it in detail.
Yeah, I tried to summarize it.
But I think that the point is that there isn't going to be any category that is satisfactory, and that the fact that we have these disjunctions between categories has to be made productive. If we can present ideas and end up with more answering questions, but then also inciting more questions, that has to be the purpose of knowledge. Not closing down, but opening up.
Thank you. Yeah, I will try to get through two more questions. This question pertains to your emphasis on multisensory perception, which often seems to set up a contrast between analytical and conceptual thoughts. Given this emphasis, I wonder how this figure of the heart relates to Islamic traditions of rational and speculative thinking.
That's a great question.
Probably not 3 minutes.
Yeah, in 3 minutes. I think what I'd say is that the issue of the heart is that we all have conditioned subjectivities, and the boundary between the rational and the subjective is a difficult boundary. One of the things I talk about in my book is how Descartes was apparently inspired for his idea, I think, therefore I am, in a dream, the transcript of which has been lost. So, you know, what is our boundary of rationality and how do we think about reason? What I mean by these transmedial things is we become conditioned to understand some things as knowledge and some things as non-knowledge, even though I would say that we're informed by more than we acknowledge as information. So what if we learn to think about these, you know, other forms and incorporate them into our knowing and our communicating across media and across cultures? One more thing in relation to that is that a lot of objects, architecture, actually engage themselves across the boundaries of media. And my colleague, Margaret Graves, has a lovely book about this called Elusive Objects, or Objects of Illusion, something like that, from Oxford University Press. And she actually talks about how museums complicate their own identity as objects. So again, this idea of shape-shifting, moving between categories, it's not something that comes from me thinking, oh, that would be really cool, but that this is something that emerges frequently in the texts that I've been reading.
Thank you. And the last, well, hopefully the last question, but I'll see if there are any more. So I'm curious how you would respond to Didier Huberman's critique of historicism when he argues that quite often the historian effectively chooses the pastness category available to him, which is to say the one closest to his past X, so as to avoid struggling and striking with anachronism of a category that is too present.
That was a complicated quotation to
extremely complicated quotation, but basically, I think the idea is that I think it's an interesting point which we've touched on is it, you know, are people putting these things, well, he's saying historians put things more in the past in order not to get too close to the present, but I think here maybe a flip side of that question is, can we really use perceptions of the past in the present in the museum? Can we kind of ask the audiences to understand that, as you call it, often blind spots of being in the past?
I mean, the thing is that for me, the museum is a space where we expand how we know. Mm-hmm. And we expand not only what we know, but how we know. And one of the ways in which we can expand how we know is by thinking through these other modes of ideas. The historicism, for me, the issue is that history is useful, definitely. I'm not against decontextualizing everything, but that it's not everything. And as the examples of poetry show, these ideas often move between different historical periods and regional periods. And so historicism itself, the emphasis on placing things as origins, has a tendency to make things static in a way that I don't think necessarily always fits, because a lot of ideas move around. And they also move around in ways that affect how things are made in the modern and the contemporary, but aren't even necessarily fully articulated. And so I saw briefly a question about what I write about Cubism in Turkey, and this is that's part of a much bigger project. But once I had read these texts, I could see some elements of thought that were probably present in the texts written by people in Turkey in the 1930s that I hadn't been able to see before because I didn't know this broader context of Sufi discussion. That is, my ability to analyze was too limited by what I know about Cubism and modernity and information that I have. And by knowing about an earlier period, it gave me another way to think about something that I thought I already knew.
Thanks. Okay, this is the last question, I promise. So is it fair to say that with what people currently learn in a colonized display of art objects from foreign countries, Islamic or otherwise, might gradually teach them that it is okay to take objects, phenomenon, events out of their context in hope of understanding? Do you think they might repeat this mode of observation even when they travel to those lands in hope of understanding?
I kind of get the impression that the people who buy antiquities on the black market aren't that interested in understanding. And a lot of the people who are interested in understanding can't afford the authentic objects on the black market. I think something that I would be interested in terms of that is that this issue of the original. For me, it's really important to think about how knowledge is produced and how experience is produced, and how these become preserved, not simply in preserving historical objects, but also how these become enacted in multiple forms of the modern and the contemporary. So in my ideal world, I would hope that somebody who is engaging with these ideas would also want to think about these ideas with artists who are engaging with them, so that today artists who go to art school learn about modernism as their past, and the legacy of art history that goes into art making is largely that of Europe, that is the intellectual legacy. What if we include lots of other intellectual legacies, so that your imaginary traveler isn't just thinking, oh, I can go get cool stuff and it's okay to take it back and meditate on it at home, but we can also be supporting contemporary producers of culture who are engaging not only with the heritage and formal elements of culture, but also with the meanings that are inside of those of different objects, even when they don't formally look as what in some typical way Islamic.
Okay, I think that is a very good way to end. There is one last provocative question that came up in the chat, and I think I just want to throw it out there because it is related, and if there's not time to answer it, we can finish there. But there's a question about if you want to comment on the conversion of the Hagia Sophia from a museum back into a mosque. And I think this question of religion and museums does make it relevant to a certain extent.
That is such a hard question because I liked it as a museum. So, you know, I have an interest there, right? And I love the Church of Kora as a museum, and I love the mosaics, and I find what's happening very difficult. So that's a personal answer. When I look at the example of Hagia Sophia more broadly, a museum is not a neutral space. And as it was made into a museum in 1935, that was the year after secularism became part of the constitution of the Republic of Turkey. There were protests at that time that were ignored. There were people who were protesting the taking away of a mosque. So I don't think there's an organic relationship with that memory. However, that has been raised as a way of encouraging certain interpretations of Islam since the 1960s. So this isn't a sudden decision, but it's part of a politics of reaction to something that was a deeply political decision in 1935. So I think that beyond thinking, is this beautiful or ugly as an act, going back to our previous theme, I think it's important to understand that both sides are deeply invested in ideological actions, and that these ideological actions may be over impassioned, they may be at odds with each other, but they both have elements that are rational. And I think it's at the moment, and I don't always feel that way with huge oppositions, but in this case, I think it's really important that one thinks about, you know, can there be a solution in which these two sides could someday communicate? That would be really important to me. So while personally, I don't like what's happened, politically, I can understand how it's happened. And I can see that as a process of often violent conflict and negotiation, which has actually been part of the identity of that site almost since its construction. So the Hagia Sophia is such a complicated site that, you know, if humanity exists 1,000 years from now, this is going to be a blip on the give and take of what that building has been through.
Fantastic. Thank you so much for answering that question. And thank you for your time and for this really amazing discussion. It was a pleasure personally for me to have you here.
You guys are amazing. Thank you so much for inviting me, and also for those wonderful thoughts about the work, reflections on the work, ways of moving away from it and opening in other directions. And also thank you all, both the people who've asked questions and the people who listened. Thank you all for your interest and for coming and talking with us. This was just lovely.
Yeah, and thank you to Mirjam and Pooyan as well for all your amazing thoughts. Yeah.
Absolutely. Those were really, really fascinating for me. I so appreciate it.
Yeah, and this will be recorded. So for all the people listening, you'll be able to find it online as well.
Yeah. Thank you so much. I really appreciate it, all of you.